And then lastly, we talked about youth gang involvement. Importantly, we talked about different definitions of gangs. We'll go through this a little bit quickly, but criminal code talk about how criminal organization, 3 or more people, where they're getting together to commit serious offenses for profit. It's the main purpose of getting together. Police services define gangs as groups who are engaging in intimidation or trying to monopolize or control certain areas of unlawful activities, so certain types of crimes. And then different research definitions. So sometimes researchers just rely on official data. So did the police themselves, the police agency, define this individual as a gang member? Okay, fine. We'll define them as a gang member as well. Or we can talk to the person and ask them about, for example, whether they define themselves as a gang member or not. Historically, we've thought about gangs in terms of like being of specific ethnic groups, or youth gangs versus adult gangs, or gangs that commit crimes for very specific purposes, whether it's like street cred or for finance or to be more organized like a business. But what I would say is that these historical perspectives have begun to break down, in part because through things like social network analysis, we see that there are not these clear gang boundaries. And in fact, when we look at research on how gangs survive and have greater longevity, gangs that are more diverse in terms of things like age and ethnicity typically survive longer because gangs need to constantly recruit. And if you decide that you're only going to recruit white individuals who are 40 years or older, you're kind of restricting the pool of individuals who you can recruit. So gangs have to be a little bit more flexible. One of the things I think I really try to emphasize in class is that there's a permeability to gang boundaries. What I mean by this is that gang members don't just co-offend with members of their same gang. So this was a case study that I did of members of what we'll just call the BC gang. That's not their actual name, but for confidentiality, I can't reveal their name. We had 18 individuals of this BC gang, and we looked at all of their co-offenders according to their court history. And when we look at their co-offenders, like 75% of them were individuals who were not members of the BC gang. So some were members of a different gang, others were just not gang members whatsoever. But the point here is that it's not like gangs are confined to the gang members. Gang members will co-offend with a variety of other different people, and this can be important for police, for example, to understand, so they're not just focusing on other gang members. In terms of longevity, gangs need to be able to recruit, and this can sometimes relate to having greater levels of diversity. Initiation can be important in longevity because initiations make people feel like they're more a part of something kind of special or important, and that can increase the length of time they'll spend in the gang. Once they're in the gang, it's important to have cohesion. So individuals have to get along. So here's where we can see where gangs need to balance cohesion and diversity. If you're recruiting too many new people, then maybe your cohesion isn't going to be as strong. So you have to find that balance. When we're looking at criminal behavior, it's really important for gangs to not just focus on like violent crimes that give them more street cred. They need to be earning money because some people won't want to be part of a gang that's not making money, but also usually these gangs need legal funds. And so if people are committing violent offenses, there's going to be a lot of need for legal funds, but if people aren't committing things like drug trafficking, there will be no money for those legal funds. On the topic of, again, gang boundaries, gangs need to have alliances. It's important to work with other people outside of the gang in order to create new criminal opportunities. So to learn a little bit more about youth involved in gangs, I talked about the Incarcerated Serious and Violent Young Offender Study and what we learned by interviewing kids who are gang involved and non-gang involved. So the first thing that we needed to do was establish whether gang members were more active in criminal behavior compared to other offenders who were not gang involved. So I didn't want to just compare like a gang member to your average high school kid, because of course gang members are going to be involved in a greater level of offending. We need to think about from the perspective of like courts and corrections, probation officers. Does being a gang member matter for your risk of offending? And what we found was, yes, it definitely does. Gang members had higher levels of offending, more serious offending, more time spent incarcerated, a lot of different things. Well, what we also found was that gang members were characterized by a much wider range of risk factors compared to non-gang members. Whether we looked at substance use or school behavior or involvement or family-related dynamics, gang members were characterized by a greater amount of risk factors. So, it's not just that gang members offend more frequently than non-gang members because of being in a gang. It's also because gang members carry all these other risk factors that are also influencing offending. So then we wanted to begin to understand gang members better. So we asked them a lot of questions about like whether they were recruited or how they joined the gang, were they initiated, did they leave, were they allowed to leave, and so on. So some of the things that we found was that kids were generally motivated to join gangs by money. It wasn't so much like I was getting beat up at school and I needed some protection, so that's why I joined. Kids were attracted to gangs because of money. And it wasn't like they were being coerced to join gangs. They were joining because typically a friend or a family member was part of a gang. That doesn't mean that coercion didn't occur, but mostly they had friends and family members who were part of the gang, and that's how they got in. And most kids were initiated in the gang, and there could be a real wide range of types of initiation. Sometimes kids were jumped in or beaten in. Other times they had to commit certain offenses for the gang or make a certain amount of money. And we began to find associations between the natures of motivations for joining gangs and the nature of initiations and how long or whether a kid left their gang. So for example, kids who were coerced to join the gang were more likely to stay in the gang. Kids who joined because a family member was gang involved were more likely to stay in the gang. Kids who experienced more severe initiations, like getting jumped into the gang, were more likely to stay in the gang. So by getting beat up, they were more likely to stay in the gang, perhaps because they were fearful that if they left the gang, they would also get beaten up. Gangs that had specific rules, and more specifically, gangs who used violence when members violated those rules, were gangs that were more likely to have their members not leave. Make sure you have a look at that aspect of the lecture to get a better understanding of sort of why and how kids join gangs, leave gangs, and so on. What Martin Bouchard and I did in a study is look at how gangs decide who is going to commit homicide offenses by using social network analysis. So we looked at this idea of the suitable co-offender. So why do individuals select particular people to commit a co-offense together? And can commit these offenses for different reasons. It could be related to, for example, they share similar traits, whether it is ethnicity, age, gender. One trait that they could share is gang membership. Another trait that they could share is like past history of committing offenses together. Another characteristic could be network centrality, which is a very social network indicator. It can indicate how much prestige an individual has. So if an individual is high in centrality, that might mean that they're an attractive person to commit a co-offense with because they're well known, and that might give you more credibility as well.